is Melinda Kennaway. I'm the Executive Director and co-founder of Kudos, and hopefully it's a startup some of you will know of, particularly if you were here last year and witnessed really quite an emotional awards dinner when Kudos won the ALPSP Prize for Publishing Innovation. So we were all extremely excited that evening, and I'm looking forward to having a bit more of a relaxed evening tonight, but my heart will be very much with the finalists this evening. Metrics is a topic that's really close to my heart and central to many of the ideas that we're developing at Kudos around research performance management. In some ways, it's still incredible to me that the impact factor has lasted as long as it has. It was never designed as a measure of quality for individual articles or authors, but I think its simplicity and the absence of any equally simple replacement has meant that it's hung on. As well as its simplicity, I think we also have some problems around the fact that the way the current system works does support many. I think particularly if you are an established researcher with a good network and a reputation, you can get into high-impact journals. But it can be more problematic if you're at an earlier stage of your career. And I like this example from the young Einstein. When he was trying to get published, this is a rejection letter that he received saying, "Your ideas are too radical for publication." So we have a system at the moment that penalizes often left field ideas or anything that doesn't quite fit the status quo. But I really do think that we're about to see some big changes in research evaluation. And it's something I've been learning a lot more about in my role at Kudos than when I was more sort of focused on publishing industry specifically. And I think it's really coming home to me how quickly things might start to change. I think particularly if funders start to drive the performance agenda more strongly. And I believe that's likely to happen. Competition for funding is on the rise in just about every part of the world. So it really is time for individual articles, individual authors to be judged on their own merits. I think it's also a time to question whether the article and books and the way in which we think about content are being delivered in the best possible way, the optimal way for effective research communication. Because we have the technology now to look at a much wider range of research outputs in much more nuanced ways. What we lack at the moment is an agreed framework for doing so, but I've got no doubt that's going to come, and Ben will be talking a little bit more about that in a moment. Beyond creating new measures for research performance, we also have the opportunity, I think, to rethink at a more fundamental level the outcomes we're striving to achieve as an industry. And this has come up in several other speakers' talks during the course of this conference. For the quarter of a century that I've been involved in academic publishing, we have, as an industry, had an obsession with these ideas of excellence and quality. But perhaps all that time we've been focusing on the wrong topic, aiming at the wrong target, when the OECD and many others clearly state that actually what drives societal and economic progress is innovation. And innovation is something that's slightly different, obviously, to excellence. If you haven't read this article, I heartily recommend it by Cameron Naylan and Damien Patterson and others on the fetishization of excellence. But it's a really good read and goes to the heart of lots of things that I've been thinking about recently. So delivering innovation requires us to think quite differently, and it will certainly have a greater focus on knowledge transfer and application. Imagine that your job as a publisher is to drive innovation, to broaden the reach and accelerate the uptake of research discoveries and ideas. And what if your authors were measuring you in your success at being able to do this? How would that change your role, your strategy, the services that you offer? These are the questions that I would be considering right now if I were a publisher. I think as we move into a world where research performance assessment is going to change, but likely so the outcomes that we're looking to achieve as well. So I think even the most die-hard defenders of the status quo must surely see that change is coming. And I don't think it's going to be a question of this metric or that metric predominating. I think the change is going to be a lot more fundamental and broad-ranging than that. And reimagining the building blocks of reputation for the future is something we're paying a lot of attention to at Kudos. Certainly it's a hugely complex problem. I don't think it's a problem any one company, individual initiative can solve, and certainly not overnight. But we're certainly looking at how we can help maybe take some small steps with bringing publishers and researchers onto this path that's perhaps heading in a slightly new direction. So for today, we're going to, in this panel session, going to be focusing a little bit more on the immediate present and the more immediate future and some of those ideas. We have a really great lineup of speakers. I'm so excited to be able to introduce these great thinkers in our industry to you. First up is going to be Ben Johnson. Ben is a higher education policy advisor at HEFKI, and he's been heavily involved with the Metric Tide report, essential reading for everybody in this room. And he'll talk about some of the findings from that report with a focus on responsible use of metrics. After Ben, Jennifer Lynn, who is Director of Product Management at Crossref and also previously from PLOS, is going to talk about the infrastructure challenges that we have, how we can rebuild the infrastructure we need to assist with article metrics maturing into mainstream impact indicators for research. Liz Allen, after Jennifer, many of you will know from her previous role as Head of Evaluation at the Wellcome Trust, recently joined F1000 as their Director of Strategic Initiatives, and Liz is going to look at how we might build metrics that describe the qualities and characteristics of research beyond a focus on articles, giving us a more holistic view and understanding of research outputs. And finally, Dr. Claire Donovan from Brunel is going to talk about the rise of an impact-aware culture within universities and stress the importance of a combination of qualitative alongside quantitative measures of performance, and also describe what this ethical impactology, which is a phrase I really like, what that might look like. So each speaker is going to come up for about 15 minutes, and then we will convene as a panel at the end, and we'll take questions then. So if you could save your questions till the end, and hopefully we can have a lively debate when we've all finished. Thank you very much. So first up is Ben.
Hi, thanks, Melinda. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here at this conference, and you know, as Melinda said already, metrics is clearly a very important live issue for lots of people. So what I'm going to do is try and talk a bit about why it's important, and then describe a bit about the work that HEFKI did on producing a report around metrics, the Metric Tide report that came out last year, and then to discuss how we plan to take forward some of the work in the report. The report itself, as you know if you read it or come across it, is quite hefty, and in 15 minutes it's going to be a bit of a challenge to cover everything. So what you'll get is a bit of a highlighted kind of edited version from me. But there is an opportunity for questions. So if I gloss over things, then that's why. So a little bit about HEFKI first. We're the largest funder of research in the UK, investing in teaching, research, and knowledge exchange activities. Oh, it's gone. It's disappeared off there. I'm going to have to. Oh no, there we go. We're back. Around about £4 billion a year goes from HEFKI to universities in England. We regulate and oversee the universities in terms of their quality of their teaching and research and their financial sustainability. And we also operate something called the Research Excellence Framework, which is a periodic assessment of the performance of UK research, which we operate on behalf of the entire UK. So why do we care about metrics? Well, it's really because measuring things matters to us. And you know, in research, if we can tell the good research apart from the bad research, then that allows people like researchers, academics, to build on what is valuable work, pursue promising directions. It allows universities to appoint and promote the good people that are doing the good work and to support the good departments. People like me, funders, and people who work in government can understand a bit more about performance, can benchmark it, and then can also support the high quality work. And publishers can develop new products and services that build upon quality and can improve existing ones. And with metrics, if we can put numbers on it, then we can feel a bit more like we're making objective decisions. And I think in terms of thinking about quality, for researchers, I think for many researchers, quality is bound up with publishing. And publishing articles in many disciplines and books as well in some disciplines provides the reputational capital and the esteem for those researchers who need to get on in their career. And that's been like that for hundreds and hundreds of years, that publishing matters. And quality is judged in publishing at the publishing stage still through the process of peer review. So we're still, in many cases, using peer review, subjective, qualitative judgments of quality of value in the publishing process. That's not to say that metrics don't matter. They are everywhere. They're in all walks of academic life, really, from universities trying to understand a bit more about their own activities and their reputation and league tables and so on, and for publishers trying to learn about the reach and the impact of their work, and for academics trying to understand a bit more about what is important work that I need to be reading and engaging with, and also how well am I doing, and are people interested in my work. I think what's interesting is that a lot of metrics are based on publishing still, so they act as a layer on top of the fundamental process of peer review that supports articles. So things like citations and so on really are the outcome of a resource-intensive peer review process, even though they might mask it. And as I mentioned, it's not just in academic life in terms of academic publishing and activities. There are other metrics that are becoming increasingly important in higher education, for instance, league tables and rankings, which in some cases are underpinning major strategic decisions that are happening in universities in the UK and overseas, and governmental decisions about how to invest and understanding how a country is doing in terms of benchmarking its performance against others. So in the UK, we have this report that's produced every now and again that undertakes a comparative performance analysis between the UK and other nations, research-producing nations. And as you can see from that paragraph of text there, it talks about characteristics of the UK in terms of the numbers of the amount of money and the numbers of researchers and stuff, but in talking about the quality of the research that we've got, it's about citations. So it's about, and downloads, it's about publishing still. So we still bind together all of our metrics that matter in terms of systemic analysis with this act of publishing. That's also true in the Research Excellence Framework, which, while it makes modest use of metrics, it did last time, that's still very much bound up with publishing and with the act of producing outputs in research as much as it is about impact of research on the wider economy and society and the vitality of the environments that underpin research. It's really about the quality of the work that gets produced by academics. And the REF is based on peer review, and as a result is a very visibly resource-intensive activity. And while it drives around £10 billion of funding every time it's done, it still costs about £250 million. And while a 2.5% overhead is, you could argue that's not great, £250 million of money feels like a lot of money to people, which is why there is pressure to investigate whether things like the REF that are based on peer review, that feel supplementary to the existing peer review processes that happen in academic life already, might be best replaced by metrics. And there have been pushes both from within the academic community and from publishers to move towards a more metrics-based approach in the REF, which is why in 2014, the then Minister for Universities and Science in the UK, David Willits, asked HEFCE to undertake a review of the role of metrics in research assessment and management, thinking a little bit about the ref, but also trying to ask some broader questions about what the value is of metrics in trying to understand the quality of research and the activity within different disciplines, and the contribution of metrics, and what the contribution is to excellence and also impact. So that was where the Metric Tide report came from. We established a steering group chaired by Professor James Wilsden, then at the Science Policy Research Unit at University of Sussex, and now at University of Sheffield. He established a steering group with support from my research policy team, encompassing the list of people that you can see there. As you can see, there's a range of people from academia, from a metrics background, some people from publishing, and other people from policy, really to try and steer the research to understand a bit more about how to move this debate forward. The approach that the review took was to open up rather than shut down the question. And what we weren't asking was a narrow question about could you do the ref by crunching some numbers in a machine and saving £250 million, or it was actually a larger question than that, looking at all sorts of things about the cultural and technical challenges around metrics, and trying to understand a bit more about how viable metrics are and what their effects are within the academic world. So there was a formal call for evidence, and lots of stakeholder engagement, a significant in-depth literature review, which is the biggest literature review I've ever seen, something like, I think it was about 200 pages long, actually. And then some analysis of the ref outcomes to see whether or not they correlated with the available metrics at the time. So that produced a number of reports in totaling about 500 pages, which is why it's tricky to skim through in this short space of time. But they're all available at the link there, and worth a read. So just going through some of the headline findings based on the work that was done. I suppose the main one really was that the review found that right across the research community, metrics remain quite a contested issue, and are quite open to misunderstandings in a lot of cases. And it's controversial to talk about metrics. This was a major finding, and even the review itself was often kind of proposed as being some kind of major intervention to kind of make things cheaper and leaner and meaner. Having said that, peer review, as a result, as you might suspect, peer review is seen as the gold standard by many people that the review spoke to. Even though it's not without its problems, it's still widespread in its support across disciplines, and as a result, metrics, while they may have value in certain circumstances, they shouldn't be trying to kick peer review out of the system altogether, but should instead just be there to support the peer review process in terms of during publication and after. And some of the reason behind that is because inappropriate indicators create perverse incentives, and there was quite a lot of concern that some quantitative indicators, metrics, can be manipulated by people, can be gamed, leading to unintended consequences. And you can see that in terms of some of the concerns that were heard around they're too reductive. The complex facets of the quality of my research cannot be reduced down to a single number. Metrics just are not applicable in my discipline, and metrics reward those that play the game, and they punish rebels. And that's exactly the kind of thing that we need to be discouraging in order to have a diverse and vital research environment. It's not to say they were not without merit, and they are capable of giving us new insights into research, but they can only do that if they're underpinned by open, interoperable data infrastructure. So including things like identifiers for research, but also thinking about how transparent the plumbing is and how much we can critique the metrics to understand exactly where these numbers come from, rather than just parroting them out and making our decisions based on them blindly. For the ref, we found that while there was some correlation at broad levels between the outcomes of the ref and the metrics that were identified for the review, at individual output levels, they just didn't match up. So what that tells you is that you simply cannot use the existing level of metrics as a replacement for using peer review to judge the quality of individual outputs, even if it might be possible to do so at an aggregate level. Through these conversations, this idea kept coming up about using metrics responsibly, and how if we wanted to use more metrics and take advantage of the new technologies and new systems and insights available from metrics, we needed to make sure that we were doing so responsibly. And for that, there are 5 dimensions to that. We must be robust. Metrics must be robust. They must be based on the best possible data, both in terms of accurate data, but also in terms of coverage. We must be humble in accepting that sometimes that metrics should never replace our qualitative expert assessment of research. Metrics should be transparent in terms of making the data collection and processes and analytical processes open and transparent, so that those that are being evaluated can actually test and verify the results. Metrics should recognize that the world is diverse and that there may be variations by field in how applicable metrics are. And that therefore we need a variety of indicators that can support those different variations and career paths. And also that often you can't measure things without having an effect. So this idea of reflexivity is quite important, that sometimes when you start trumpeting the use of metrics, even if it's only to develop better understanding about the system, you can inadvertently encourage certain types of behavior to chase after the numbers rather than chasing after the new insights and high quality research. So in terms of recommendations then, the first is that the research community should be developing a more sophisticated and nuanced approach to the to the contribution that metrics can make. And for that in mind, this idea about indicators rather than metrics is quite a helpful idea, because it just gives you a better sense about the limitations of these things, but also what their true purpose might be. University leaders should be developing a statement of principles on how metrics are being used. And the research managers within those universities should champion the principles that their universities produce. They can be different for each university. We're talking about context-specific principles here. And really make sure that metrics are used responsibly. Now, some of the criticisms that we encountered during the review were that academics felt that their university bosses and particularly their research managers just didn't really understand very much about what they were doing and fell back to using the metrics that were available as a stick to hit them over the head with. So you must produce more work, you must publish in more top quality journals, and you must bring in more grant income. And that was felt to be extremely unwelcome and quite damaging to the research process. And I think we probably all recognize that those sorts of behaviors need to be, they contradict the idea about responsible use of metrics. So our recommendation in the review was that research managers should instead become the champions of responsible use of metrics rather than part of the problem. And likewise, when HR managers and others are making decisions about who gets promoted and who gets hired, they should be very transparent and explicit about the criteria that are being used, and when they are using metrics in those criteria, then they should be open about that. And individual researchers cannot escape blame entirely themselves for this. You know, they should also be mindful in the way they present their own work and successes to the outside world, that they do that in a way that is conscious of the limitations of particular indicators. And so they're, moving away from, I have an H index of 100 and that kind of behavior, because it can have damaging effects on other people. And research funders too should also develop some principles about how quantitative indicators will be used in the assessment and management of research. And those that are producing the rankings and the league tables and the data should therefore strive for greater transparency and interoperability so that we can get a more joined up, more clear, open and transparent system here. And likewise, publishers that are, at the moment, in some cases, very overly emphasizing their journal impact factor as a marketing tool, should instead start to think about what other metrics might be available, and think about maybe what the variety of journal-based metrics might be that can provide a richer view of the performance of a particular journal. Recognize there is value in journal level metrics, and I think it's interesting to hear all the conversations about the journal impact factor at the moment, and there aren't that many new ideas for what the replacements might be. I mean, no one out there is suggesting that every single article in a journal of a particular impact factor is the same quality. So it's interesting then that there are these perceptions out there in the academic community of that, and therefore suggestions around things like citation distributions are quite powerful, I think, in trying to provide alternatives. DORA obviously comes to mind then as a way of trying to challenge some of the things I was just talking about in terms of judging individual articles only according to the title of the journal they're published in. So one of the recommendations is that there should be a greater uptake of the Declaration on Research Assessment within UK universities. And likewise, the infrastructure should be more transparent, so principles should be developed to support that. And I know that Jennifer's going to say a bit more about that too. We need the identifiers like ORCID. They're extremely important for being able to identify and link things to people. Likewise, we need the DOIs on objects if they're going to be captured in a system. There is no citation database out there at the moment that captures all of the articles being published, and even then it's only articles. We're still missing books and everything else, so we need the identifiers. And finally, the community really needs a mechanism for taking forward some of this. It's fine for the report to make these recommendations, but how is it going to get done? So the report recommended a forum for responsible research metrics to be established that would bring together key players to work on those technical issues around data standards, openness, interoperability, and transparency. But also to look at issues around how to improve the culture of research within universities, particularly in the UK, in terms of how metrics are being used by managers and also by academics themselves. So we have today announced that there will be a new UK Forum for Responsible Research Metrics established as a partnership between Universities UK, JISC, HEFCE, Research Councils UK, and the Wellcome Trust, bringing in David Price, who is the Vice Provost for Research at University College London, to chair this new forum, which will meet for the first time in December, and will start to think about how best to tackle some of these issues. The forum clearly has a wide remit, looking at trying to sort out those issues around how to fix the plumbing, but also how to improve the culture and the use of metrics. So it will engage fully with all relevant communities in trying to advance the agenda of responsible metrics and to have some more meaningful conversations about how to do that. So I'd be very interested to hear from anybody who would like to take part in some of the conversations that would be taking place over the next couple of years in the area of responsible research metrics. So if you go on to any of the websites of those 5 partners listed there, you can find more information about the forum, including the full membership. And it's lovely for once to be able to have a talk where I'm able to announce something. So there we go. It's out. And so please do have a look. And otherwise, thank you very much for your time.
That is so exciting that the forum has launched today. I feel like this is a memorable moment in the same way that, you know, the declaration, the DORA was put out, that the Leiden Manifesto was put out, this too as well. So I really do want to encourage all of those of you interested to actually participate and engage with this forum. I am Jennifer Lynn, and I'm just going to jump right in. Slightly different than the summary, if I may apologize, but we will be talking about infrastructure quite a bit. So metrics abound, right? We have no shortage of them. The ones that you see in this list are citation-based. Which one do we choose? They may be calculated slightly differently based on the actual data set, based upon the algorithm that's in play. They may weigh certain factors over that of others. But what all of these have in common is that they are largely based on at the level of the publication and the journal that they were published in. And then all of a sudden, around 6 years ago, we have an explosion of even more metrics into this field. Some may call this alt metrics, pulling from a far more diverse range of activities that occur on the journal of record, the publication of record, the journal itself. On top of these, we have an exploding number of different research outputs that are increasingly considered worthy of assessment as well. Say, data underlying the research publications, the software that was created in order to generate the data underlying the research publications and results. What are we to make of these metrics, and what do they matter to publishers? I don't want this session to be an academic study of the world out there, but rather a discussion about what this actually means to us as a publishing industry. Publishers are actors operating and acting upon this very world. So we know why we have metrics at a high level. It offers the capacity to reduce, simplify, and integrate information into a portable, easy to digest package. With $10 billion of HEFKI, we're going to have to be able to figure out how to distribute the resources fairly and appropriately. Metrics help divert secondary and tertiary information by way of its exclusion. So not only do metrics make it easier to access and process information, but they also seem more authoritative. This simplification process produces three effects. One is the redistribution of resources, as I mentioned, the redefinition of work, and three, it paves the way for our proliferation of gaming strategies. The quantification in decision-making has a number of benefits, as already illustrated. It mitigates conflict, it overcomes distrust, and it coordinates across both social and physical distance. For effect two, the redefinition of work, I want to spend a little bit of time just trying to flesh out what this might mean, just to be able to put forward a diversity of perspectives when we're talking and thinking about metrics. We can ask what is happening in this process of evaluation when we use metrics. Metrics turn persons into analyzable and manipulable units through the work that they do, if that is what is being measured. The scholar then becomes a subject, or rather an object subject, to continuous supervision across partitions of space, time, and movement. The scale of control applied is not just wholesale in the unit of large populations, but also retail, very deeply personal, as the values, incentives are socialized and internalized by the scholars themselves. So what we're saying here is that these instruments go further than measuring organizational reputation. They actually transform and constitute the scholar as a managerial object. Some thinkers would call this a form of disciplinary power enacted through a larger system of monitoring control. One of the sociologists, Michael Power, situates this problem quite elegantly as a historical and socioeconomic product of late modernity. We have a lot of different forces, he says, playing into this: globalization, individualization, regulation, all playing into this need for organized practices of evaluation and critique. And what it has resulted in is an audit explosion, or some would call an audit culture, through regular university and researcher rankings, some of which were screenshotted in Ben's talk before. The application of such techniques has a double role. It marks the gaps, hierarchizes qualities, skills, and aptitudes, but it also punishes and rewards. Such instruments do not merely reflect pre-existing perceptions, but they in fact become part of the reflexive sense-making dynamic for some actors. This very much gets to the point of reflexivity, which was in the metrics tied to responsible metrics observations. Metrics shape perceptions. They define both organizational and individual academic attention to reputation. So they are both reactive as well as performative. And this reactivity, if you will, reflects the mutuality of researchers' responses to the metrics that they are subject to. And it produces unintended consequences, right? There's a dynamic social mechanism that you could say Thomas Merton talks about, where prediction becomes a new factor in changing the conditions under which it comes true. There's an economist, Charles Goodhart, for whom the Goodhart's law is named after, and essentially boils down to a reduced formulation that says, when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So all of this is very abstract, and while some of this could be highly debatable, none of this have escaped the researchers themselves, those who are on the ground subject to the metrics. So the researchers, as well as other conscientious parties, have over the past few years come together, and we've witnessed a number of vigorous responses. I won't go into DORA, as well as the Leiden Manifesto or the Metric Tide. We've all heard about that already. But those are three very strong examples of positive directions in which we're all coming together and getting a better handle on what is this evaluation process all about. Metrics hold real power. They are constitutive of values, identities, and livelihood. And so this is a very difficult problem that's not only technical, but also socio-technical. Can we create metrics trusted by the community they serve? Might metrics be used to better express the shared noble values of the scholarly research enterprise? I have no answers for this. This is the province of experts, some of which are on the panel with me. But as an infrastructure provider, I would like to lay out some of the requisite foundational components that we need to actually properly tackle this question. Infrastructure. So infrastructure, defined by the Webster's Dictionary, is the basic physical and organizational structure and facilities, for example, buildings, roads, power, and supplies, needed for the operation of a society or enterprise. And as you may have heard, as it supports the running of the whole enterprise, it is by and large mostly invisible. But you feel it when it breaks, when the power is cut out, no water flows out of the pipes, et cetera. The system can grind to a halt. So if we focus on infrastructure, as I mentioned, the metrics problem is not only technical, but also social. What I would like to put forward is that infrastructure itself be more broadly understood as both technical as well as social. These are the four different areas that I'll try to illuminate more as we continue on. Standards for infrastructure are quite important. NISO has put together an altmetrics initiative working group, which I think started about 3 or plus years ago. And they're currently in phase 2. But the phase 2 subgroups have been doing a lot of very practical work, defining altmetrics and use cases, coming together to establish a data quality code of conduct that puts at the forefront transparency, replicability, accuracy, and reporting. All of these are very incredibly important if we're looking not only at altmetrics, but metrics of any kind. What are the basic components of it? How can they be most usable as it is applied to all of the data collectors which are taking part in the formation of these metrics? There's a certain data environmentalism, if you will, and I think that these requirements are probably very much reflected in the Metrics Tide report. Another element that the Metrics Tide report talked about is the need for the underlying data to be made available for the purpose of transparency. And I would argue underneath it all, not only transparency, but trust in whatever metrics are developed and used. We have parties right now that are collecting the data surrounding the publications in very many different ways. This is quite notable in the altmetrics space, where you have multiple providers that are individually collating from external platforms and pulling this through individual bilateral agreements. This leads to a number of disparities, not only depending on how the data is structured, how the data is defined, how the data is collected, et cetera. So one of the infrastructure components is having a single clearinghouse by which all of the raw data can be made available to everyone systematically. And I think that one of the things that isn't thought quite a lot about is it's not only the data, the underlying data, which gets pulled into the actual metrics themselves, but at a larger level, we need a better understanding of how all of these research objects connect up. They connect up to people, right? And they connect up to institutions, to funders. At this point in time, if you have an eye into the messiness of metadata, et cetera. We do not have systematic ways of being able to identify who published what, how was it funded, and what other types of research outputs is connected to, say, a publication. And this webbing of scholarly communications is really, really critical in order to actually systematically and fully assess research performance. We need to have identifiers for people, and we have this through ORCID. We need to have identifiers for research institutions, for funders with the Open Funder Registry. We need to have identifiers for the variety of materials out there that are linked up to the research content, whether it be data, software, preprints, conference papers, other books, other types of special issues that are pulling from, say, a journal article, peer reviews, translations, et cetera. All of these need to be linked up, and it's not only until we can capture all of this, can we, in fact, get a much broader view of a researcher's performance. And it's not until we can get all of this knitted up can we actually capture all the activities surrounding it, whether that be citations, shares, discussions, recommendations, bookmarks, other instances of reuse, et cetera. Another piece of infrastructure, moving on from standards and data, are the people experts. Right now, at this point, while we have a long tradition of studies, scientific studies, analyzing how citations of journal articles are distributed, in what ways do they differ between one community to another, et cetera, there's very little of it in the new altmetric space. And this, I feel like, is a big need, which some of the early bibliometricians are turning their attention to. We need more of it. We not only need to better understand the nature of these metrics, but also their impact on researchers as a way to get a handle on their effectiveness, as I mentioned with Goodhart's Law. And the fourth last component of infrastructure that I want to put forward is governance and oversight. And I feel like the forum, actually, with the announcement today, might in fact serve a large part of this, if not all of it. Metrics do require a collective and cross-sector response, not only because it's cross-discipline and also it's geographically distributed, but it represents quite a diverse set of practitioners and practices that are specific to each community. So given all of that, would a single body be just the right fit to provide responsible stewardship and governance necessary for supporting responsible metrics? This is a question I put forward to everyone. I don't know. A group of us have been thinking through some of the common problems that we know exist. And there's an opinion piece that's forthcoming that lays all of those out. And at the very end, it does ask the question, would a single body, non-proprietary entity be an appropriate body to actually begin to coordinate some of these efforts? So publisher call to action. This is where we come from. This is our world. We need data to construct metrics that reflect values. We need to deploy these metrics in a way that have a constructive impact, and we need to establish cultural norms that promote good citizen behaviors. But information scarcity prevents us from doing all of these. We cannot properly validate our assumptions and our hypotheses about the metrics, and neither can we improve on them because we don't have, say, that level of transparency that's needed at the bottom. I feel that publishers are contributing to this lack of transparency and this erosion of trust if the data that they generate, meaning us, by data, I mean the content, the metadata about the content, are not made available, are not machine readable, are not precise / disambiguated. So I would call all of you in the room who represent publishers to think about this, stop building this data desert, deposit and share fully the metadata that you have. Also, to Ben's earlier point, carefully consider the metrics that you promote on your journal through any outreach materials and sales materials that you may have on the journals that you run. These do get carried forward to the researchers in the communities that you represent, so please do carefully consider them. Thank you.
Okay, I too, Melinda, I'm very sorry, I also have changed my title, and I've got another title there as well. So I went for, I think one of the things that I just wanted to raise in this discussion is the whole, and I think Ben and Jennifer have both already hinted at this, is we need to sort of make sure we know why we're using metrics in the first place. And I think it goes bigger than, you know, the audit culture and kind of research performance measures. I think that's all part of it, but the big picture is actually what we're trying to do with science. We're trying to make discoveries and bring about impact and accelerate things, and that's why we need metrics, not the secondary audit is part of that, but that's not the big picture. So I think that's kind of the key issue here. So I think what we're trying to do with metrics is kind of improve the opportunities to understand how we do science better, how we bring about discovery, how we accelerate impact. So beyond article level metrics is kind of part of that, but I think the big picture is the important thing. And I think one of the things that having moved from a funding agency to a publisher, although an interesting type of publisher, I think it's really important the role that actually publishers have in all of this. And I think the idea of being involved absolutely in all the initiatives that Ben is starting up and the work that Crossref is doing is kind of key, because we are the place where a lot of the research is shared in the first place. So that's kind of the key thing. Okay, so this is a bit of a scary slide. I'm not sure, I liked the image, so I've used it anyway. I think one of the things that I think publishers kind of are in a bit of a crossroads at the moment, because you hear it talked about very much that we're at a time of change in the publishing world. There's lots of new ways for research to be shared. And as the place where researchers kind of use publishers to actually communicate and share their research, there's lots of opportunities to kind of change the way that we do things, to speed things up, to improve access, and metrics are all part of that. So some of the things that you hear about, the concept of journals are kind of a little bit outdated. People read articles, they don't necessarily go to journals. People are using platforms much more. Some of the terms that we use in publishing, so print, PDFs, the concept of flipping models from open access, closed access, subscription models to open access kind of is just tinkering around the edges. The whole concept of open access for me is kind of, it was never about visibility of the page. It's actually so that other researchers can use that science, get hold of the data, get hold of the science, and actually build on it. That's what the whole point of open access was. 10, 15 years ago when it was started, open access kind of, the focus was to, you know, to start that process. But actually now we've got the opportunity to kind of open it out and allow people to actually get hold of that work and accelerate impact. In terms of the publishing process, some of the issues that we've been kind of trying to deal with at F1000 that you hear about quite a lot, you know, the actual current publishing process, there are lots of delays, and people talked about that in the plenary this morning, and we heard it from Philippa this morning around the delays and the kind of issues that raises for researchers. It is really difficult to get hold of the data a lot of the time still, and that's actually what researchers a lot of the time want to do. There are all concepts, there's lots of challenges with peer review, again we heard that a few times this morning, which introduces biases and causes problems again for researchers. And then from a funding perspective, it's a massive cause of waste. Unless we can kind of get rid of some of these inefficiencies within the publishing process, it's a lot of waste funding, duplication, hidden research. A lot of research isn't published in the first place, those kind of issues. And coupled with this, the world is moving really fast, technology is moving fast, there's a demand for rapid access, people want to get hold of the findings in public health emergency situations, people want to be able to publish quickly, share, move on, kind of make an impact, and there's a lot of demand for data around. That's a good case study, but there's lots of examples where, you know, in the genomics community, clinical communities, people want access to the work that's being done by their colleagues and people across the world so that they don't, you know, they can build on, they can use it and don't duplicate. And then the big picture here in the discussion here is also about impact. And again, I still want to keep making sure that when we're talking about impact, what we're talking about is kind of trying to accelerate impact for everybody, for science, for research, for everything. So I think the opportunities we have basically is to start thinking about how we reinvent what we do and how we think about publishing. And I've put publishing in inverted commas there. I'm not sure this is necessarily the view of F1000, but it's certainly my view. I think the word publishing kind of are we really talking about sharing there? We're looking at new ways to reinvent how researchers can share their work. We, as publishers, have all the technology and the kind of innovation to be able to do that. So it's kind of in our interests, and it's kind of in our specialty to be able to sort of help researchers do that. And we need to stop thinking about the word publishing in the traditional ways that we've thought about it. Okay. So the sorts of things, again, that I've been sort of thinking about, and we're working on F1000, and we are talking to lots of other agencies around, you know, thinking about moving beyond journals. People don't necessarily focus on journals, and actually beyond articles. I think the idea of an article being the finished product for a piece of research is kind of outdated, and that's happening already. Researchers are already doing that, and we just need to kind of embrace that and kind of work with that. Another thing that I was involved in at Wellcome is thinking about the concept of authors. That's also quite outdated, particularly in a lot of the life sciences. You have many authors who haven't actually written anything on that piece, but they've contributed something massively important, and it's important to kind of break that apart as well and stop thinking about, you know, authors in the old-fashioned way that we did when journals were first started. So again, we need to think about ways to acknowledge who's done what somebody's contributed, who's the specialist, who can you therefore follow up with. It's practical reasons to try and accelerate the science. It shouldn't just be about credit. I think one of the big opportunities, and I think Jennifer talked very much about this, is lots of the bits that are kind of included in an article are now digitally object identifiable, if that makes sense. But if you have objects around, you have DOIs around databases, software, code. Sorry, my voice is failing today. And what that means is it kind of breaks away from the article being the unit of assessment or the unit of the thing that you're tracking. You can track things in an individual right. You can track the contributors or the person who actually was responsible for those things as well. So we need to, again, start thinking a bit more radically about how we do that. And then, of course, you know, there's lots of different ways in looking at how people use it. We need to just start rethinking how we allow access to different pieces, how we can accelerate people to be able to use and reuse the work that they find. And I think here the key thing for me is that there's a real opportunity here for us as the place where research is shared to act in a new way. For those of you who don't know, F1000 Research published, opened, it's we call it an open science publishing platform. It's not a journal. We don't have a journal impact factor. We publish a huge range of stuff. And yeah, it's kind of a different way of working. The data, we won't publish without the data. Everything has to be you know, identifiable, trackable. I won't go through the details of how the process works, but essentially this was us testing out a new way of working. In completely open science principles, all peer review is open as well, so we use open and transparent peer review, which it was again nice to hear Philippa this morning talking about. You know, that's something that's coming. A lot of researchers are much more comfortable with open peer review. eLife, they did an experiment. There was something in one of their blogs this week about the kind of strength and kind of interest in open peer review as well. So other people are trying it. There isn't as much fear in the community for some of these new approaches. So I'll just go through these quickly, but this is basically the features that we have on F1000 Research. So it's lots of open science principles. And again, this is something that the EU is promoting, so we kind of have to, you know, work with that kind of framework and kind of embrace it and move forward. There's still peer review on the site. So F1000 Research has post-publication peer review. Again, it's a new model, but it's being used. People are interested in trying it out. And what it does do, it opens things up much quicker. We can provide a huge range of use and reuse metrics. And there's all kinds of new features around, you know, versioning, continuous publishing. Open peer review also opens up the concept of you getting credit for the work that you've spent trying to peer review or actually contribute to other people's work. So again, what we're trying to do is rethink the concept of peer review being about deciding whether something is, never mind novel or interesting, but worthy of publication. It's actually, if the researchers are wanting to share that, you can put that, that can be published, and basically you have, you get credit for the work that you've done in contributing to other people's work, like commenting on their research findings. So we've been playing with we've actually been running F1000 Research for 3 years, And we're now working with research funding agencies and institutions to kind of completely rethink the publisher's role. Again, we're thinking very much about we are providing the tools and the services to allow researchers to share their research. That's essentially what we are as publishers, but we're doing it a different way, and we're doing it in collaboration and partnership with funding agencies, and we're talking to a lot of research institutions also. Our long-term vision is that you'd have some kind of scholarly web where researchers would publish in a much openly, quicker, rapid way, using some of the kind of features that the research community embrace and want to use. And therefore, you would just link it to all your different funders using systems that Jennifer talked about. But what we're doing a pilot with the Wellcome Trust. It's been mentioned in a couple of the other sessions today. What this does is it allows research, anyone who has a link to a Wellcome funded grant can put any research on this platform. It's completely paid for using open access article processing fees. What Wellcome aren't doing is mandating their researchers to publish on it, but what it allows researchers to do is, with the and kind of endorsement of their funder, the funder's saying, look, if you've got research that you want to share that you are finding it very difficult to publish elsewhere, or you want to publish here anyway, or you want to do it rapidly and move on, or you have research protocols or case studies and things that negative null findings, all this kind of stuff, they're saying that Wellcome is saying, we have funded this work, we would like to see it. So if you'd like to publish it and you want to share this, then here you can do it on this platform. F1000 is basically providing the service and the infrastructure behind that, so we will do the peer review for them, so it's all the content remains quality assured, and we will do all the technical services, we'll provide access to the data, we'll issue DOIs, all that kind of stuff. And that's kind of the model we're doing. We're doing a pilot with them which launches later this year. So what these kind of approaches do, it basically changes the way that we can assess research. One of the issues in the past has been that everything has been very fixated, as Ben mentioned. Publications, sharing research in a journal was hugely important. It still is important, but the way that you share is potentially completely different. The way that you now actually can use platforms and you can use different bits of your article, you can use data software, all those kinds of things. What that actually does is, and open peer review, things like that, it opens up the piece for the different kinds of impact that you might be looking for and different things that you can actually now use. I don't like the word alternative metrics because it implies secondary. I think when it first came around, alternative to me was basically anything that wasn't a citation metric. So things around attention, and they're not secondary, they're hugely important. They might be different in different contexts, and one size does not fit all in terms of a definition of impact. But what new approaches to publishing and sharing does, it basically opens the piece for all these kinds of things that actually might be more important to you than a citation-based H-index. And I'd like to go back to Melinda's kind of concept of this. I think this is a really important question. Are we aiming for the wrong target? I think that's right. But for me, I don't really think we always know what the target is. I also don't think there is one target. I think one size does not fit all. And we've been typically trying to shoehorn citation-based metrics into different targets. And I think that's not right. We need to be much more flexible, much more responsive, and much more tailored. And I think now we have a wider range of potential impacts and kind of products of research and outputs to track. That will come. So I think, yeah, do we know what the target is? I don't think there's one target, and I think we need to make sure we're using the right metrics in the right context. So just to finish, I think one of the key things that, for me, I've always been interested in kind of research efficiency, how to do science. That's what we should be trying to do with all this metric stuff. And we all should be working together. So I would really like, Ben, I was involved in the HEFCE metrics when I was at the Wellcome Trust report. I think it's really, really important that publishers are involved in that discussion right from the start and on an equal footing as all the funders and kind of researchers, because that's the problem. Sometimes the publishing industry develops lots and lots of metrics based around its own platforms, but often they're not quite what the funder needs, or they're not quite what the institution needs, and technology must not drive business needs, and that needs to be very integrated as a place or people who would provide a way to share research. We absolutely need to be involved in those discussions around, so what do you want to capture, what do you want to track? So it's really important to kind of have that collaboration. As Jennifer mentioned, infrastructure is really important. standards and definitions around what we mean by certain things, making sure that we're very open about how you construct a particular metric that might be a citation-based one, but it might be about engagement or something else. That's really important that it's open and, you know, people are using them in the same way when it does affect audit and it does affect research performance, but ultimately it affects how we do science. And then I think once you have a wider piece of metrics to kind of use and kind of start to analyse, it will reduce the reliance on erroneous journal impact factors for decisions because there isn't anything else. And I think Claire's going to talk a little bit about some of these things. But for me, what it is about is then you can start to really look about which metrics are important in which context and how you can make things more efficient and more effective. So that's me. Anyone can send me an email. I'm always open to discussion about this kind of thing. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. I'd like to start by thanking Melinda for the invitation to contribute to a panel on such an important topic at this event. So I'm going to be talking about the idea of committing metricide. I'll get onto that in a moment. I'm going to be talking about research impact, but not in the context of the impact factor or journal impact factor. I'm going to be talking about impact in the sense of evaluating the broader effects or benefits of research for wider society. So this is probably getting as far beyond article level metrics as you can get. And I also hope that you like neologisms, because you're going to encounter a few here, some of which may be a little bit tongue-in-cheek. So I'm going to be talking about committing metricide, but also the need for an ethical impactology. So impact. It's a hot topic in the UK, and the routine evaluation of these broader impacts of research was something we wouldn't have really heard of about 10 or perhaps even 5 years ago. But now it's, I think, reasonable to say that the UK is the most advanced at the national level when thinking about the impact of university research or the impact of research upon society more broadly. And so we're now dealing with quite an impact-aware culture within the university sector. But nonetheless, the practice of assessing broader impacts has run far ahead of its theory, which raises a few alarm bells. Now, currently, Nicholas Stern has been conducting a review of the Research Excellence Framework and its future, and the role of metrics within this, and the role of looking at broader impacts within this exercise as well. So it's a good time now to take stock and reflect on what might be the positive or negative aspects of assessing broader impacts and possible future directions. So today I'm briefly going to outline UK practice, describe the rise of impactology and how impact fatigue might lead to us committing metricide. And I'm also going to outline the case for ethical impactology. Now, this is really important because this whole notion of assessing broader impacts is a hot topic internationally, and many countries have been following the UK's lead and are waiting to see what happens next in terms of informing their own policies and practices. So UK higher education institutions or universities rely heavily on government funds which are received through a dual support system. So one half of this comes through the UK research councils. This is in the form of competitive grants, and these amount to around about £3 billion per year. So in terms of impact, the UK research councils require all grant applications to include a pathways to impact statement that describes the applicant's strategies for achieving broader economic or societal impacts. Now, currently, the research councils are defining impacts as fostering global economic performance, specifically the economic competitiveness of the United Kingdom, increasing the effectiveness of public services and policy, and enhancing the quality of life, health, and creative output. So that's quite a broad definition. Now, often there are far more research proposals that are highly rated for excellence that can be funded, and it can come down to whether there's a believable, practical, inventive impact, pathways to impact section that can actually be the deciding factor on whether funding goes ahead or not. Okay, the other half of this dual funding system comes from the Research Excellence Framework, or REF, about which we've heard a fair amount already, especially from Ben. So universities get an annual block grant based on their relative performance in the REF exercise. The last REF was conducted in 2014, and approximately £1.5 billion was distributed to higher education institutions for the year 2015-16. So the REF is a national research evaluation exercise, and it's rating the relative performance of groups of university researchers or units of assessment, or what we might think of as departments, by discipline. So scientific quality or publications account for 65% of the ratings of these research groups. Research environment accounts for 15%, and broader impacts counts for 20%. And so this impact criteria was first introduced in 2014, so it's a relatively new thing. And how this is assessed, there's an impact template where groups set out their approach to creating research impact, and then there are impact case studies that demonstrate what's called the reach and significance, or breadth and depth, of broader impacts. And these case studies are presented as a narrative and ideally are supported by evidence, including any appropriate metrics. So the REF for 2014 defined broader impacts as an effect on change or benefit to the economy, society, culture, public policy or services, health, the environment or quality of life beyond academia. So virtually everything's covered there. And there was also panel-specific or discipline-specific guidance that went into a bit more detail as well. So the next REF exercise is due to be conducted no later than 2021, and it's still out there because it's under review, but the impact criterion may possibly increase from 20% to 25%. So this is becoming more and more important for the sector and for the people in the room here in terms of thinking about what is the evidence of impact and how do we deal with this. So, as I've said, the UK higher education sector really does have an impact-aware culture, but there are concerns about the future of impact assessment in the REF in particular. Now, Ben Martin, who's a distinguished professor at SPRU at the University of Sussex, has written about research assessment exercises for a long time. And he's argued that the quality assessment component of the REF and its predecessor, the research assessment exercise, so this is the publications element, has run its course. In his opinion, there's no point running this exercise in terms of quality anymore. He thinks since the RAE has been invented, the overall quality of research standards has been raised. And so the costs, financial, behavioural or institutional, of any future REF will outweigh its possible benefits. And he thinks that eventually this will be the case for the wider impacts as well. So I've got a quote there. He says, "There will no doubt be widespread criticism of the simple-minded approach adopted, and work will start to improve the assessment of the impact following the first REF. REF 2 will consequently be more elaborate, more burdensome, and more time-consuming. It will also encourage more sophisticated game playing," and so on for the next REF beyond that and beyond that. So the shape of the REF is currently under review by the UK government, and Lord Stern has been leading that review. And one of the terms of reference was to look at perhaps reducing institutional and researcher burden, and also looking at whether metrics can reasonably replace the narrative element in the assessment of wider impacts. So Stern has reported and firmly is not recommending metrics only, but a mixed approach that is highly reliant on narratives. But there's now a further consultation phase, and we've still got to wait for the final outcome. So that sets the scene a bit. I'm now going to talk about the rise of impactology, or the rise of the impactologists. I was at a workshop for the National Science Foundation in Washington in February, and collectively we came up with this term of impactology, which is slightly tongue-in-cheek, but it's the practice of assessing wider impacts, and it's also people like us gathered in the room who study the practice of assessing wider impacts, which is my day job. There's also a rise of a new class of impactologists, or impact professionals. These can include managers within universities that are trying to help research groups to make their best case for the next ref. But there's also consultants, including professional case study writers who support this process. There are also new for-profit companies supplying impact documentation or recording software and offering training courses for how to better make your impact case. So impactology is becoming more professionalised and it's becoming more bureaucratised. So it's important, though, to guard against expedient pressures to save time and money by pursuing impact metrics at the expense of more appropriate and more nuanced assessment approaches. So impact fatigue, or we could call it ref fatigue, assessing broader impacts of research at the level of the ref in 2014, as I said, was a world first. So while initially controversial, there's now grudging support among the UK's academic community for the narrative approach to assessment. But this grudging approach needs to be balanced with the fact that writing impact statements and impact case studies involves a great deal of time and effort, and that many academics just want to be less regulated and left alone to get on with research and teaching. So anecdotally, after the last ref deadline was over and we could all relax, several of my colleagues in the UK confessed that while the impact case study approach was more fair and equitable than simple metrics, particularly for the humanities, arts and social sciences, they were so tired of the burden of the ref that they would just take metrics from that point onwards. So we can call this ref fatigue, or more generally impact fatigue. But I am concerned that a weary backlash against bureaucracy presents the danger of committing metricide. Okay, go back. So what is metricide? Well, how broader impacts are defined and assessed is a vital issue. So, for example, in 2011, there's an expert workshop on the state of the art in assessing research impact that concluded that best practice was the use of narratives supported by any available robust impact metrics. Now, little has changed in recent years in the form of innovation or best practice, the exception really being the nascent and yet to be realised promise of ALPmetrics, which Jennifer talked about in more depth earlier, and also social media data linking publications, dissemination, and engagement with research users to broader impacts. So in this light, the approach to assessing wider impacts in the ref matched the state of the art. So as mentioned already, the system is currently under review. And James Wilston quite recently produced a summary of submissions to the consultation phase of the ref and observed that there was widespread recognition that robust metrics for impact don't yet exist, and such that narrative case studies assessed by peer review remain the best option. So while the future of the ref hangs in limbo, we shouldn't, though, take this reasoning for granted. Again, Ben Martin at Sprue has drawn our attention to the fact that best practice in assessing broader impacts comes from a long tradition of evaluating research outcomes in health and medical sciences. There's something called Payback Studies. I've conducted one myself. It took 9 months to do with a team working for me. We used mixed methods to produce very detailed accounts of the impact of research on the research system, on product and drug development, on changes in clinical practice and public behaviour, and improvements in service delivery, health gain, and economic returns. But for Ben Martin, he says this is like a craft industry with bespoke items being ordered for specific clients. If we're talking about the whole sector being evaluated, he argues we're moving from craft industry to mass production, and we need to be able to more simply, more quickly work out what these impacts are. And that's where metrics seem to promise efficiency in terms of time and money saved. But is this at the expense of nuance and detail? There's one parallel I can draw internationally with a similar exercise in Australia, something called Australia's Research Quality Framework, and very much a similar narrative approach was recommended for assessing research impact, but a new minister came along and said, this looks too complex, abandon it. And so the narrative approach was replaced with patents, plant breeders' rights, registered designs, and registered commercialisation income. Those metrics were used for the whole sector. I have to declare an interest. I chaired the government committee that recommended the narrative approach, but I'm not bitter, honestly. But we can see that if these are the only metrics, then that's quite a limited picture that can be produced. So I'm just winding up now. I think I'm echoing very much what other panel members have said. So we seem to be drifting towards some kind of consensus. We need to be arguing as a panel, don't we, to create some excitement. So for an ethical impact, impactology, we've heard about the metric tide already from Ben, and the metric tide isn't to be confused with metricide, which is what I'm talking about. So we've heard about the recommendations of that report, and the other speakers have also mentioned the Leiden Manifesto that want the responsible use of metrics in research assessment and management. There's no need for me to go through this really because Ben has done this in detail already. I would say that the important point is that all of these ideas, this responsible approach to metrics would seem like a good starting point for devising an ethical impactology. So just to conclude then, I'll just throw a few questions out there. Might ref fatigue or impact fatigue be symptoms of innovation that is going wrong? Is it that the technology is leading the process? Is the tail wagging the dog? Perhaps the largest change ahead of us is to retain an impact-aware culture, but with less regulation, and to use the lens of responsible metrics without completely falling into a mass production mode of assessment. It's important that definitions of research impact remain open and defined by the academic community, rather than closed down and restricted by impactologists and the limits of whatever simplistic data is to hand. Overly data-driven systems are likely to neglect social and cultural impacts and overlook the distinctive contributions not only of the humanities, arts and social sciences, but all research endeavours and what they mean for society at large. I hope that didn't make anyone seasick, by the way. But,
Okay, thank you very much to all our speakers, and particularly thank you everybody and the speakers for bearing with us in that flickering screen scenario. It's a bit unnerving when you're about to make an important point and you look down and there's a blank screen, so apologies for that. I'm not going to try and sum up all of that. I think there was a lot to digest. I did, however, write down 3 points that I felt were particularly important that came out of that. 3 things I wrote down were the word indicators. I think I really like that as a guide, a direction of travel rather than an absolute, which I think is a healthy way to look at assessing research. I also wrote down metrics should be about how to do things better. I think that's also a good sort of guiding principle. And finally, I wrote down too much waste in the publishing process, with a little sad face next to it as well, which you can't see, but I guess we could see that as an opportunity too. So we just have a moment to take some questions. So I'm going to open it up to the floor, and please do ask away. I think we've got a couple of roving microphones to hand. Right, Phil, first up.
Hello, Phil Hurst, Royal Society. We talked quite a bit about research articles. I mean, obviously there's other research outputs out there like sharing data, like peer review. How would we go about measuring those kind of outputs?
This is automatically on.
Do I need to turn it on? Yeah.
Okay. I'll jump in. So there are quite a number of groups thinking about how do we collect data in order to be able to develop metrics for these other types of scholarly outputs. The Force 11 data group has been working with how do we capture data citations? How do we collect the data citations? Once we have the citations, then what do we do with them? There is a separate software group that is also addressing the same thing. One of the prototypes, which I find to be really interesting right now, is a collaboration between Data One, which is a large union of data repositories, working with CDL and DataCite. So we have a number of it's an intersection whereby they're able to capture usage at the level of the data repository, knit it up to the metadata surrounding the data sets itself, as well as linking it up to any sort of subsequent publications that have come out of it. They're also collecting other types of activities that may surround it, such as altmetrics. The reality of it is now that when research results are shared, at this point, it's by and large at the unit of the journal article that is associated with it, and not the data itself. I think that very much we expect that will change over time once data sets become entities of it in and of themselves, their own thing. Oh, the name of that collaboration or experiment is called Making Data Count.
Anyone else on the panel have anything to add to that?
Probably just to say that that's quite bound up with the issue that a large number of research outputs, particularly in the arts but also in the humanities, are not available in the digital domain at all, and some will never be available in a digital domain. So the answer probably for those is that it's very hard without first transitioning some of them to a digital domain to get metrics on them. And books in particular spring to mind, where there are some particular cultural challenges and technical and business model challenges to moving towards e-books, and then thereby having particularly usage metrics on them. But also, I think for those things like intangible research outputs, like performances and exhibitions and things like that, it's very hard to imagine how they can fit into a metrics framework that's applicable to more traditional or text-based forms of output. So they may need their own metrics, or they may just not be countable at all. And I think we have to face up to that.
One last thing, the corpus of Crossref DOIs is more than 81 million, and this is largely comprised of, say, journal articles, but there are a lot of different contents types that are included and have DOIs, which will, at once Crossref event data launches, will then be able to provide expose some of this activity surrounding these very different types of objects.
Okay, any other questions? Yeah, okay, Judy.
Hi, Judy Luther. I'm from the US. I'm a consultant. And I work with a couple of societies whose impact includes regulations made by the US government, both in the area of actually impacting Wall Street and impacting food protection. And because these citations or references to research, and they have to have published research to refer to, peer-reviewed published research in order to make these regulations. But the regulations, but the usage doesn't count because it's occurring in a sector where it's officially really in gray literature. And I'm wondering if there's a parallel in the UK and if this is on your radar, or when you look at responsible metrics or the impact on society, if this is on your radar and there are any thoughts about how that might be addressed.
I think that's really important. Lots of organisations in the UK and throughout the world produce grey literature, which are hugely important, and they often reach policymakers and have the impact perhaps much quicker than original pieces of research that might be a research article. So that it is hugely important. We're looking at actually issuing DOIs around grey literature. We're working with a couple of policy research institutions at the moment to actually have documents classed in the same way as a research article would be, so it will be traceable, discoverable. And one of the things that, again, we did when we were at the Wellcome Trust was look at trying to link references on things like clinical guidelines, so you can actually find the guideline that the reference, the actual research had led to, and linking the two together. And I think that's kind of, again, something that is key. I think some areas, to go a little bit back to what we talked about before, I think some areas it's much easier to do this kind of thing than in others, and I think the life sciences particularly probably there's a lot more scope to do it quickly. But yeah, it's something that's really important, and I think it's coming.
Yeah. And essential as well for tracking impact, which then would hopefully cut down on some of the difficulty that can be had by those that trying to understand the impact that their research is having outside of those databases that are capturing traditional academic impact. So the more that can be done on that, the better, I think. Really start to understand and that stuff a bit better, and to place research in a context that's embedded in the economic and social impacts that it's having. That would be a very positive change, and would also mean people don't have to spend as much time writing narrative case studies for the ref.
Well, I would like to speak in defence of narratives and case studies, but there's been quite an interesting development in the Stern review of the Research Excellence Framework, or REF, and how impact's dealt with within that. And part of the way that case studies had to be put together included having to cite underpinning research, and it had to be of 2-star or above quality. And I think this made many institutions panic and want to put in journal articles because they believe that could easily be identified by a panel as having a certain amount of quality. And the new recommendations say grey literature should be included. And so hopefully this will boost the use of grey literature. And it's nice with the examples that the lady who asked the question gave, because there can be citations to changes in practice, etc., that are out there in the grey literature, or you can draw on that. So hopefully watch this space and see how the practice developments. But it's certainly encouraging and great to see the grey literature becoming a part of that narrative.
One specific type of grey literature that might not be very obvious, but to me is very much of interest, is the type of literature that you would call a syllabus for a course, whether that's in a classroom setting or online. Increasingly, there's more evidence of the syllabi in digital form, and as that increases, I think we'll be able to pick up more of that systematically in a machine way. There is a project called the Open Syllabus Project, which is just beginning to get that. But how in the world do you collect all of the syllabi across universities globally? That's a big question. But I think it would be very much of interest to, when assessing larger researcher impact, not only amongst other researchers, but in the field of teaching, education, etc.
Great. Well, we're just about out of time, I can tell by the rising noise from outside. So would you join me in thanking our panel once again for this afternoon?